Ben Kalos, representing the Upper East Side, Midtown East, Roosevelt Island, and El Barrio. Good afternoon to the Rent Guidelines Board Chair, Rachel Gotzel, public members Flax, Joza, Shine, and Wank, owner members Cruz and Willard, tenant members Epstein and Garcia. To members of the public who are here today, thank you for coming out to this hearing. I stand with you today in calling for a rent freeze. Please show your support over Twitter using the hashtag #PoundRentFreeze, and if you mention @Ben Kalos, I'll be sure to retweet you. Now let's break Twitter. I request that the Rent Guidelines Board vote for a rent freeze that is a 0% increase for 1-year leases and a 0% increase for 2-year leases. This rent freeze will help correct the course of extremely high rent increases over the past years, the current environment of an affordability crisis plaguing our city, and the data produced by the Rent Guidelines Board. Over the past generation, Rent Guidelines Board increases have far outpaced inflation and the Consumer Price Index. I have personally compared the past 20 years of Rent Guidelines Board increases against the Consumer Price Index and found that the Rent Guidelines Board outpaced the Consumer Price Index by more than 14%. That means a $500 a month apartment in 1994 is now a minimum of $906.19 a month, with an annual rent over $10,874.22, while following the inflation for the same unit would be $786.30 a month, and that's about $1,438.60 less a year. The Rent Guidelines Board must freeze the rents until inflation finally catches up to the generations of increases as high as 5% and 8.5% that provided landlords with windfalls that far outpaced the rising costs that these increases were intended to address. It seems that I have 40 seconds left, so I've proposed most of my testimony in writing, so I can waive it if you like and answer questions, but if I may just say that the time is now for a rent freeze for my district and for all of New York City's rent-stabilized tenants. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today, and if you're interested in looking at the CPI versus RGB increases, we've attached a spreadsheet on the back and you'll find it quite informative. Thank you.
Before anyone asks any questions, can I ask everyone in the back of the room to please keep it down a little bit? We very much want to hear the councilman's answers to any questions. So folks in the back of the room, we can hear you up here. Any questions from the board? The guard is. Any questions?
Councilmember, thank you very much for your testimony. I really appreciate it. So we've heard landlords come out and say this rent freeze, they'll make them condo buildings, sell buildings. It'll be disastrous on New York City's real estate market. But what do you say in response to that?
I've already spoken to a lot of the landlords. In fact, I was once a renter with the chair of the Rent Stabilization Association, and my response is it means that they have to be a little bit less greedy. It means that they don't necessarily need to make 200%, 40% profits, and when they say that's not sustainable, my response is that there's a lot of nonprofit housing developments throughout this city, throughout the country, and throughout the world. And there is no guarantee for profit. It's not necessarily something that needs to be there. And at the end of the day, they've been receiving so many increases that far outpace the Consumer Price Index and inflation that all this does is give inflation a chance to catch up with the increases that they had specifically to address inflation and the cost of living increases.
Hi. Did I understand you correctly that you're suggesting that owners should turn into nonprofits in order to be owners of rent-stabilized units in New York City?
If a landlord cannot afford to make less than 200% profit or more than 40% profit, and they are unwilling to make 6% or 9%, which is what most of us make when we invest in the stock market or put it in a high-yield interest, yes, I'm willing to work as a council member to make sure that we increase innovative offerings and allow nonprofits and support nonprofits so that they can increase and support our housing stock. If a landlord doesn't want to own something and make that profit, there are nonprofits in a city more than willing to step up.
I want to clarify something, though. I feel like the numbers that you're giving speaks to sort of the hyperbole that comes from people like you, that, you know, a 200% profit margin, 60% profit margin. It hurts my heart to hear things like that because it's such a misrepresentation of the reality. I don't know how you got your math. I don't know how you got your numbers. And I feel like it's irresponsible of you to be espousing numbers like that are completely incorrect when people will take you at verbatim. I go on the record for saying that almost every single number that you gave tonight was inaccurate and misrepresentation of the reality for the owners, and it is not a nonprofit. It is not a nonprofit organization that controls the rent stabilized. This is not a nonprofit organization that controls the rent stabilized units in New York City, and I'm beside myself to hear things like that from someone like you.
Sure. So,
Can we hear the councilman answer, please?
So if we want, we can go through every single number that I proposed with the comparison of the CPI index to the Rent Guidelines Board, if that would be helpful to this body, but it's on the record and it is 100% accurate. My sources are listed. So I can say for certain that we are increasing with the Rent Guidelines Board much faster than inflation. So do we disagree about that?
Yes. We don't, sorry.
Okay, so...
Sorry, we do not agree on...
If you would like to share that document, I'd be happy to share it with the board.
You should have it there. So in 2013, last year, there was a 4% one-year increase and a 7.75% two-year increase. That was RGB Order 45, and the average CPI in last year was 1.5%. So that's 2.5% over the CPI for the Rent Guidelines Board 1 year. That not the case.
We're passing around the document that you're referring to right now.
I just want to talk about facts.
So we have your information in front of us, and it's very useful, and so this is now available to the board and can be made available to the public if necessary.
Okay. And with regard to the profit indexes, there are federally mandated programs for affordable housing which guarantee a 6% profit level. The New York State statutory interest rate is 9%, and with regard to the 40% and the 200%, that's with regard to some of the luxury development buildings that I see in my district. In fact, in my district, there are pieces of land that are going for $18 million that are being replaced with 40-story, 20-unit per floor, $1 million per unit buildings, and we're looking at things that are close to $1 billion that somebody picked up for $18 million. And we actually just defeated in the Landmarks Commission a hardship application where somebody paid far less than anything else and wanted to do the same there at the First Avenue Estates at City and Suburban. So those are the numbers that I'm referring to.
Thank you, Councilman.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Robert Liu, and I have a 20 units building in Forest Hills, Queens, for 17 years. 3 are rent controlled and 17 stabilized. The average rent increase in the recent 12 months compared to last year. For 1 year is 2.8% and 5% for over 2 years. 40% of my tenants are paying lower than $890 per month. At the same time, however, the burdens of keeping these affordable apartments for the New York City has become more and more difficult. My water bill in the last 12 months increased from $9,724.95 to $11,944, an increase of 22.83% over the previous 12 months. Utilities increased from $10,500 to $16,000, a 53% increase. Heating oil for the 2013 winter heating seasons of October to the end of April 2014, charges increased from $22,000 to $34,000, an increase of 54%. My real estate tax in 2013 was equal to 27.4% of my total rental income before I deduct all the operating costs. Right now, I have to do the fire escape repainting, some roof repairing, boiler replacement, etc. These jobs that I would have done in the past if I was financially able to. My maintenance costs would increase more than 100% this year. I keep working hard to help the city for the affordable apartments to lots of old tenants who've been living there for over 30 years. One tenant lives in a rent-controlled apartment for 50 years, and her son has been living with her for 40 years. For over 15 years, her son plays golf every week, but paying $232 for a two-bed apartment. I'm also helping the tenants with financial difficulties, however. This year, I have reduced the increase rates for two tenants by reducing half of the rates. So to be fair and to help owners like me, we need the city to increase the 6% for 1 year, 9.5% for 2 years, together with the $950 minimum per month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me? Sir? How many units do you own?
20. 3 rent control, 17 stabilized.
Okay. And do you make a profit?
No, almost
No.
break even.
You break even or do you make a profit? No?
Very marginal. Very like, if I recall correctly, like 7,000 or 5,000.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
City Council Member Mark Levine.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Levine. I'm the council member for the 7th District in Manhattan, which includes Washington Heights, Hamilton Heights, Morningside Heights, Manhattan Valley, and the Upper West Side. I want to thank you for providing me with this opportunity to testify today. The communities I represent in northern Manhattan include a huge concentration of rent-regulated apartments, which are home to residents who are overwhelmingly working class or low income, with a high percentage of seniors on fixed incomes. Over the past decade, these tenants have been caught in a vice, as real incomes have stagnated or declined, while their rents have consistently risen faster than the rate of inflation. If a landlord of a rent-stabilized apartment increased rent to the maximum amount allowed each year for the past 5 years, a tenant in my district and elsewhere would have seen their rent increase by over 21%. That figure does not count the other ways in which an owner can raise rent, including MCIs or individual apartment improvements. The result today is a rent burden that averages 32% of total income for uptown families, with many bearing the nearly impossible burden of rents approaching or even exceeding 50% of income. This situation is simply unsustainable, and the result has been a wave of evictions of tenants for whom rents have slowly but steadily moved out of reach. The most aggressive landlords uptown, backed by predatory equity investors, are exploiting rising rents to accelerate the pace of evictions. They know that every percentage point increase in rents will push housing costs beyond the reach of additional families, which will make it easier for landlords to haul them into housing court, where they know that only 10% of tenants will have attorneys, compared to over 90% of landlords. Not surprisingly, of the 30,000 evictions in New York City last year, it's estimated that over half were from rent-regulated apartments. And so it is that the decision the RGB makes on rent increases will directly affect the pace of evictions in New York City next year. It is indisputable that higher rents will lead to a greater number of evictions, and this fuels our city's record number of homeless, and it accelerates the loss of affordable units which exit regulation by the thousands after eviction, thanks to the disastrous vacancy decontrol loophole. I know that the majority of you, the majority of the members of the RGP, care about tenants and care about this crisis. So I am imploring you to not accelerate this crisis by further raising rents this year. In short, I'm calling on you to freeze rents. Freeze rents. Freeze rents to avoid evictions, freeze rents to prevent homelessness, freeze rents to avoid the loss of precious rent-regulated units, freeze rent because it's the right thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Councilmember. The story we've heard from small landlords is that they're struggling and rent freeze will just really cause damage to our industry. What do you say in response to that?
Property values in my district and across the city, including in districts with the highest concentration of rent-regulated units, are skyrocketing. Why? Because as units are becoming vacant, landlords are exploiting this to maximize rents to move them to market rate. The real estate industry is prospering in New York City. Property values are at an all-time high in many neighborhoods. This gives landlords the financial basis they need to both provide decent building services, to live within the law, to live with a rent freeze, and still make a reasonable profit. All right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, Councilman, I have a question for you. Sorry, it takes me a little while to move around. Again, to clarify your position is that we should not factor in any of the landlord operating expenses or conditions of real estate into our decision-making, but rather have it be 100% on a tenant evaluation. Is that what your statement is?
This is a balance. You've got to balance on one side landlord's financial situation, and you have to balance on the other side the conditions of tenants in this city. Today, it is a statement of fact that tenants are suffering to a degree that landlords are not. Tenants have endured a financial squeeze in recent years that is untenable for many of them. And I'm asking you to consider the impact on evictions, on homelessness, or the loss of affordable units through the rent regulation system. There's no doubt that any additional increase in rents will accelerate all these negative trends, and I think you must weigh this heavily as you make your decision.
Thank you. Again, to clarify the word balance, what I'm hearing isn't quite a balance. Are you talking about like a weighted average between the tenant and the landlord side, or a a weighting that's 100% on the tenant side? I hear sort of the beginning salvo, which is balance, and then I hear the ending statement, which is tenant. And I'm trying to understand the political position that is being spoken here by not just you, but other politicians that have come in front of us. Are you, please just clarify for me so that I can understand, are you saying that this year you feel like needs to be 100% tenant weighted versus any, and what that would also mean would be to disregard any increases of operating expenses for or debt service or anything like that that we've looked at as far as the data that's been presented to us for the landowner? Are you saying that it is for this year tenant only consideration?
As I said, you've got to look at the financial condition of owners and the financial condition of tenants. One side of that equation is prospering, one side is hurting. That should weigh heavily on you. You have an opportunity to do the right thing for the most number of families in our city, and I hope you'll do that. Thank you.
So, Marietta Hawks, Liam Gregory, Tim Collins, and then Faith Steinberg.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, staff, and Rent Guidelines Board. I would like to thank the RGB for listening to my testimony. My name is Marietta Hawks, and I represent tenants in Stuytown who are disabled and too frail to come here to testify today. These seniors, working class, and middle-income families rely on rents remaining affordable, so we can continue to live in Stuytown, which we call home. I am also a member of the Stuytown Tenants Association, Tenants PAC, and Met Council. This year, we deserve a rent freeze because of the MCIs we have received this year. The legislation for MCIs must be amended. It is unfair and unjust for tenants to pay forever for a pavement, water tower, security cameras, windows that leak, roof, etc. We're paying forever for these improvements. Living in Stuytown, I pay 45%. I'm in Stuytown 37 years. I pay 45% of my income to rent. This year alone, I have paid $55 a month for 5 MCIs, and this is forever. And in addition to the 7.50%, it's an increase in 1 year of 13%. Due to these increases, I have to cut back on food and doctor visits. Because of CW Capital harassment of tenants, frequent apartment inspections for pressurized walls, checking refrigerators and air conditioners, I suffer from insomnia and high blood pressure. Every day I look under the door for papers from CW Capital to see how they're going to harass tenants. And what's next? We don't know. My friend Rosie, she lived in Stuytown. She was given a Gallup notice of non-residency. She's lived there 37 years. She's now in housing courts after 7 years. I had to loan her money when I did have money from my 401k to pay for the lawyer for housing court. She's now on a blacklist. She can't go any other place but Stuytown. I would like to thank Brian Kavanaugh for initiating the SCREE legislation, which will make tenants sleep at night now. They're not worrying about their rent. I'd like to thank Assemblyman Dan Garodnick, Assemblyman Kavanaugh, Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer for the housing clinics, which have volunteer lawyers to help with tenant harassment. I'd like to thank Senator Brad Holman, Controller Scott Stringer, Governor Andrew Cuomo, Carolyn Maloney, all these politicians that are sticking up for tenants.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hawks.
And also, we need campaign finance reform. In Albany, landlords write checks.
Ms. Hawks, thank you so much. We have so many people we'd like to hear from. We appreciate it. Mr. Gregas?
I am a music therapist for hospitalized children. That has been my profession for over 25 years, helping children smile when they're sick. The rest of my time, I deal with the small business of running a 100-year-old brownstone with 8 units. Yes, my wife and I own a small brownstone, and so many of you may think of us as landlords. But the reality is that this is a job with unending upkeep, paperwork, and diplomacy. We are a single family that lives in their brownstone, which operates as a small business. The plain fact is we are subsidizing the rent-stabilized tenants in the building. Taxes for the apartments is 55% of the rent. Repairs take another 20% each year. The other 25% goes to gas, electricity, water, inspection fees, and insurance. And these expenses already surpass the income received and are still rising. Now, we are a landmark district, and I have to pay them any time I need to repair the front, including a $7,000 repair for the roof this week. And none of this takes into account the hundreds of hours I put into the building for cleaning, garbage, maintenance, and paperwork. This means I am paying the tenant hundreds of dollars a year to take care of them. What kind of small business am I running if I have to pay both my vendors and my clients? A failing one. With anything less than the cost of living increase in rent, this city is encouraging this small business to fail. Now, there is also the millionaire tenant for whom we had to pay tens of thousands of dollars and years of time to evict because the burden of proof was on us, even though he was living out of state and subletting for triple his own rent. Rent stabilization profited this millionaire and sent the owner into debt. It is not protecting the needy, but is crippling, yes, catastrophic to the small business owner. None of our subsidized tenants are low income, yet they have more rights and privileges to live there and pass on their apartments than we do to cover expenses. This is our home. We call each tenant our neighbor. We get along. We react to each tenant's needs if they were our own. We treat our neighbors fairly. And the city should treat their small businesses, whom obviously our politicians do not recognize their small businesses. We treat our neighbors fairly. The city should treat their small businesses fairly. We require 6% for 1 year and 9.5% for 2-year leases to sustain this small business. Otherwise, we will have to pass it on to some big conglomerate who will not care for their neighbors.
Thank you.
Since 1970, it's in our family. Thank you.
Thank you.
I apologize for my patience, but my age is my excuse. Good afternoon. Last year, I had to go to housing court to get some needed repairs because my landlady did not respond to my phone messages, nor to a letter, nor to a conversation I had with her son. When she got the summons, she did call, psychobabbling with me names like passive-aggressive. I think she graduated from Reader's Digest Academy. And then crying about all the taxes she has to pay and the tax credit that she gets from New York City because I'm on screen doesn't help her. Now, my landlady owns a McMansion in Connecticut, has a pied-à-terre in the city, sports a mink coat, and I had to go to housing court for her to do needed repairs. And speaking of SCREE, when I filled out my application, I had to disclose my income and my expenses when I first applied. Why don't landlords who constantly cry broke have to disclose their income and expenses honestly? honestly, I recently heard a political analyst who mentions that New York State has the most corrupt government in the country. My landlady, who owns at least 6 brownstones on the Upper West Side, has now converted all the buildings into LLCs so that she can donate to the upstate PAC so that she can get rid of rent regulation. Her husband, by the way, has his own real estate business and has been to jail. This country boasts of democracy, but we are making a mockery of democracy. In the warped and manipulative minds, the monies they give to the PACs through the LLCs, they want to call free speech. I call it legalized bribery. The working poor are struggling. The business owners want to pay the ridiculous $8, finally, an hour. And the landlords want to squeeze as much rent in spite of pitiful salaries. The people have suffered rent increases year after year while their salaries have remained the same, resulting in the highest rate of homelessness in this city, 53,000, which includes families with children. I was born in the city and I love it, and I have to put my hope and trust in this new board to do the right thing and make the city a good place to live for all. If you won't roll back the rents, which I hope you will do, at least you can do is freeze the rents. Don't make me lose hope.
Thank you so much, Ms. Steinberg.
I just want to, just a little addition. Housing is a basic necessity
Ms. Steinberg,
of
we
life.
have so many people here, and it's been a pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you for testifying.
Okay, thank you.
Public Advocate Letitia James, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Letitia James, Public Advocate of the City of New York, and I stand here in an effort to protect rent-stabilized apartments throughout New York City. Rent-regulated apartments are still the largest source of affordable housing for New Yorkers. Any fiscally sound policy on preserving affordable housing must take a hard look at our rent-regulated housing and its impact on low and moderate-income New Yorkers. While it is important to build new housing, we can't afford to turn a blind eye to our existing housing stock, namely rent-regulated housing. Increases in stabilized rents impact rent-stabilized tenants directly by hiking the percentage of their income that goes to paying the landlord every month. With vacancy decontrol, however, these raises also affect the affordability of all New Yorkers' rents by making it easy for landlords to raise the rent on vacant units past the $2,500 trigger, which automatically removes them from regulation. Citywide, 9,499 apartments left the system in 2012, 71% because of vacancies. Gentrifying areas like Bushwick have seen their stock of regulated houses plummet from 41% in 2001 to 32% just 9 years later. Raising the rents on regulated apartments this year may turn them into market rate units next year. Rent increases may be a major factor driving rent-regulated apartments to the $2,500 threshold, but they aren't the only mechanism. Every time a stabilized apartment becomes vacant, vacancy enables its rent to increase by 20%. Landlords are permitted to drive up stabilized rents even further when they make major capital improvements to the building. An individual apartment improvement increases. These charges get added to the base rent and compound every time the Rent Regulations Board votes out a rent increases. Frequently, these improvements do not improve tenants' quality of life, but they are undertaken mainly to help drive up rent past $2,500. Rent increases have allowed landlords to maintain high operating incomes, while tenants' incomes have stagnated. If a landlord's bottom line were negatively affected, then an argument can be made to authorize higher rent increase, as this board did in 2008. In 2008, the board adopted a 4.5% increase for one-year leases and 8.5% for two-year leases during the height of the recession. In those increases, the board did not consider whether the rent increase would leave tenants with income to sustain their families. Impact on tenants is a valid consideration for this board under the rent stabilization laws, which require the board to look at projected cost of living indices. Rent increases are outpacing incomes. The slow recovery of our city's economy has not allowed New Yorkers' income to adjust to increased rents. Since the 2008 economic recession, tenants have been hard hit by significant rent increases, stagnating incomes, and now shoulder huge rent burdens. More than 1 in 3 households devotes more than 50% of their income to rent. And the appellate court in West End Avenue Association versus Herald has explained that the point of rent stabilization laws is not only to protect the tenant, but significantly enhance the social, economic, and demographic stability of New York City. Many of the tenants who are least equipped to pay these increases are the very people who stuck it out when their communities were going through hard times. It would be ironic and tragic if those who helped these neighborhoods, including my own former district, Clinton Hill, Fort Greene, Prospect Heights, Crown Heights, and Bed-Stuy, if they were to be priced out now of their rent-stabilized apartments, that would be unfortunate. New York should be a place where everyone can afford to live. As rent-stabilized rents become high, and the affordable housing shortage deepens, the harshest consequences will be for older New Yorkers and those who are disabled. A recent New York Times report has indicated that many elderly are considering packing up and leaving New York City. A 68-year-old Thomas Williams, a retired NYPD traffic supervisor, commented, "My pension doesn't go up every year. My Social Security doesn't go up every year, and I can barely make it." Rent increases in income eligibility for SCREE may have helped to alleviate increased rent burdens on the elderly, but we need similar mechanisms to help all New Yorkers. The Rent Guidelines Board can and should take corrective action and vote for a rent freeze for 1- and 2-year leases. This is the right thing to do, where since 2008, landlords have benefited from the protection of their net operating income, and yet there has not been any similar protection for tenants on their diminishing and declining income. As public advocate for the City of New York, I stand with my fellow New Yorkers and urge that we enact a rent freeze for the good of all New York City, for the diversity of New York City, for the soul of New York City, and for all of New York Cities. We must enact it now, doing the right thing instead of business as usual. I stand with you today and urge that you vote for a rent freeze. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Public Advocate. New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer.
Thank you. Madam Chair, thank you, and congratulations. Or condolences, as the case may be, but it's great to see some friendly faces up here tonight. And my name is Scott Stringer. I'm New York City Comptroller, and I wanted to submit testimony to you. We're going to submit larger testimony, but the testimony that I'm submitting says a couple of things. Just last month, I released a report called The Growing Gap, which is a report we did on the state of affordable housing in New York City. And the bottom line to this report is that the working poor are getting squeezed like never before by rising rents. And I think as new members of the Rent Guidelines Board, you have a real opportunity to take the first steps towards providing some relief. This is a historic opportunity for this board, and it can't come soon enough. My office found that there was a net loss of over 152,000 rent-stabilized units from 1994 to 2012. And meanwhile, median apartment rents shot up by 75%, even as household income declined by 4.8% from 2000 to 2012. It's been a classic squeeze of rising rents and declining salaries for too many working families for too long. Now, I know you will hear from small business owners who say they are suffering, but the fact is that rent-stabilized apartments continue to provide excellent returns. It's just a fact. The average rent-stabilized apartment generates $436 in net operating income each month. From 1990 to 2012, inflation-adjusted rents increased at a higher pace than costs. So the bottom line, despite multi-billion-dollar initiatives to expand the affordable housing stock, apartments have become more expensive across every income level. And for New York City to remain a global financial center and a hub for innovation in the 21st century, we must find ways for people to afford to live here. Now, here's something that you've got to consider. Over the last 14 years, we have lost 400,000 apartments that rent for under $1,000. Think about that, 400,000. The mayor's housing plan talks about 200,000 that we have to create. Plans before that called for 165,000. So we have to do everything we can to give tenants some relief, or we're going to be a city for the very, very wealthy, with enclaves for the very, very poor, and nothing in between, and that would be a great shame. I've given you some statistical data, and there's more in our testimony, but I just want to give you leave you with something as a lifelong New Yorker. Many of the people in rent control and rent stabilized apartments, Mitchell-Lama housing and public housing, they moved to neighborhoods a generation or two ago when no one wanted to live in these communities. They came to neighborhoods and built the schools, the daycare centers, the quality of life. They raised families, and they instilled in all of us a sense that they were the backbone pioneers of our city. And they were so good at what they did that the neighborhoods that they went to, where the banks didn't go, the speculators didn't go, they came, created neighborhoods, and now everyone wants to follow them. And I have to tell you something, I think it's the greatest compliment to everybody in this room tonight. I'm not against people following them, but I think here's what we as a city have to think about. You protect the people who built up our communities, and you allow new people to enjoy it too. We can have it both ways, but it's not fair just to build luxury housing on the one hand and destroy the rent stabilization program on the other. That does not make sense. And finally, as controller, I think a lot lately about the economy, not just 4 years from now, but 10, 20 years from now. And I have to tell you something, we are now a global economy. So we are competing for people to come to our city like never before. We need to attract the best and the brightest and keep the kids from New York City who have given so much and will give so much. If the entrance fee to this city is $1 million condo, if there's no opportunity for young people to create and re-energize this city because they can't afford to live here, then we're not going to be the city that's long been the center of the universe. That is not good for business. That is not good for landlords. That is not good for major corporations. And for all of you here tonight, you will make a defining decision. A zero increase for the first time in history. After years of giving away the store. Giving away the store when the fuel prices were low and expenses were low, but still said, we have to put it to the tenants. This is our opportunity just to give a little breathing room, to step back and allow our mayor to adjust what that affordable housing plan is going to look like, to calculate just how much trouble so many of our people are in. Let's do something important. A zero increase makes sense this year because now's the time to recognize that we just have to ease into things so that we can help our people. I thank you for listening. I'm excited and I congratulate all of you, Madam Chair, and I look forward to working with all of you for the betterment of the housing stock in New York City. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
So we'll have two more speakers, and then we're going to take a break to allow Mark, our transcriber, who's been working so hard for 4 hours. We'll hear from Neil Kersner and Tim Collins.
Hello, my name is Neil Kersner, and I'm the president of Alban Realty Management, a property manager of several hundred rent-stabilized apartments in Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan. I represent several landlords who entrust our firm to take care of their real estate investments and to provide a safe, affordable, and enjoyable place to live for our residents. The perception of the rich landlord is an unfortunate gross misconception of the folks I represent. The owners have risked and invested in buildings for the same reason that most of us in this room invest money in the stock market. We hope to earn a fair return on our money, a return commensurate with the risks that we take. When you invest in real estate, it has inherent high risks and costs that most of us are unaware. Landlords are entitled to a return on their investment in order to give them the proper incentive to continue to invest in their properties. If a landlord cannot earn a market-adjusted return on their investment, then the investment stops. The rent stabilization laws, while well-intentioned, create a dangerous, slippery slope when the debate turns political. The facts should be the only item in this debate that should prevail. Here are some facts culled from our own internal data comparing 2013 to 2012. Water and sewer expenses increased by 35%. Property taxes by 6%, building insurance by 16%, oil expenses by 10%, gas and electric expenses by 17%. We also incurred some extraordinary expenses: 2 backflow preventers for $20,000, $25,000 for water pumps. Local Law 11 necessitated a $70,000 exterior repair, $50,000 spent on another exterior repair, $15,000 to comply with insurance company requirements, $25,000 in legal fees for litigation from a tenant who has free legal counsel. We begrudge few of the above expenses, as we believe most of them were for the direct benefit of tenants and landlords alike. By cutting off the landlord's ability to make money, we prevent them from continuing investment, which will lead to a degradation of property over time. While we live in a capitalistic society, we understand the need for some regulation. But when regulation chokes off the ability for landlords to do the right thing, we will have crossed the line. And that is where we are today. The proposal to keep rent increases at or near zero crosses that line. It jeopardizes the entire landlord-tenant relationship and will start an inevitable decline in the quality of housing in New York. All housing in New York will become affordable, as nobody will want to live in any rent-stabilized buildings. You will have created greater problems than you think you've solved. I'm almost done. The board should allow at least 6% rent increases and $950 minimum monthly rentals. Anything short of that cements our collective knowledge that the board is not guided by what is right, but rather by some unrealistic utopian ideals that have no bearing on what it is to own, operate, and manage rental property within the city of New York. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Kersner. Tim Collins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I may be the only one speaking here today who's not a rent-stabilized tenant or an owner or a politician, and I didn't even sleep in a Holiday Inn last night. I wanted to take the opportunity. I know you've heard me before, presentation before the board, and I went on for a very long period of time talking about how net operating incomes have increased substantially over the last 24-year period. I think I laid that out very clearly in my testimony before the board, but there were a couple of questions that were raised. The chair raised a question about, well, how much of this is a result of our decisions versus other things going on in the market. In particular, we look at commercial income or unregulated units going up, and it was a legitimate question, and it kind of gets, refines the analysis a little bit further. Another issue came up. Ms. Williams-Willard had made a comparison at the preliminary vote between the cost increases over the years versus the rent increases, suggesting that the rent increases hadn't in fact kept up with the cost increases. And I think that, with all respect, and I know Ms. Williams-Willard is very interested in getting accurate numbers, that's actually not the right way to frame that question. And the reason why it's not the right way to frame the question is because in order to keep owners whole, what you want to do is increase the operating cost portion, in other words, the O&M ratio, which is about 60%, by the increase in operating costs, whether you use the I&E data or the price index. The net operating income portion you would increase by the consumer price index. Now, operating costs since 1990 have gone up something approaching 147%, and I have the numbers in my submission that I've given you. But the actual CPI has only gone up 87%. So if rents tracked operating cost increases directly, it would result in a huge windfall for owners. So in order to do this accurately, you have to develop what I would describe as an annual commensurate increase. How much of an increase do owners need in order to nominally cover changes in operating costs and protect net operating income from the effects of inflation? And fortunately, we have a way to give a good estimate, and that is in separating that analysis from commercial income and from unregulated income. We have the staff's rent index, which is based upon a projection of the effect of increases for 1- and 2-year leases and for vacancy allowances. That is like the pure trajectory of what this board does. And we also have income and expense data, and we have regional CPI data. And in the submission that I've given you, it's all laid out in a chart, but it shows very clearly that had this board kept owners whole since 1990, for every dollar of operating increases and for every bit of inflation to protect net operating income, they would have had to have increased rents by 144% over that 24-year period. It's actually 143.8, and I think that's what Councilman Garodnick was referring to earlier. We had a conversation earlier. So the board, to get a full commensurate increase, would have had to have gone about 144%. The board went 177%. So the board's authorization has grossly outstripped what is needed to keep owners whole. And those numbers are valid. You can check them against the staff's own numbers. You can check them against the board's reports. That is the reality. And unfortunately, the press doesn't get this. The press's situation over the last several years, listening to people screaming about increasing rents or buildings that are too expensive to run, has basically been a reaction of criminal neglect. And particularly the Daily News yesterday talking about how owners need increases in order to match increases in operating costs, looking very myopically at a single point in time, not realizing the context in which the tenants find themselves. And then finally, and I'll be brief, I know you've had a very long day. It's, you're very patient. You listen tenants come up here and talk about their problems, many of which have nothing to do with your mandate. And I know it's very difficult. There's a lot of pain out there. And I have said time and time again before this board, your job is not to make everybody happy. Your job is not to take away all the pain. Your job is not to make every apartment affordable. But when owners are experiencing rent increases that exceed operating costs and exceed what is necessary to keep their net operating income, and those excesses have been going on year after year after year, then you should listen to every ounce of pain that every tenant comes before you and explains, because most of it is completely unnecessary, and much of it is a product of this board's past decisions. Now, in my prior testimony, I suggested that you could do a rollback. You could do a rollback and owners would be fine. Their net operating income would be greater than it was at the beginning of the recession with a rollback. But a rent freeze would certainly be a very moderate, even a conservative approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Collins.